On weekends, the grounds of Federal Way High School were usually much quieter than on regular school days. Hallways that were normally crowded with students became empty. The car park held only a handful of vehicles, and most local residents were still enjoying their morning according to their usual routines. It was the kind of scene people could easily pass by without ever imagining that one day it would become linked to one of the longest-running criminal cases in the history of Washington state. In the winter of 1991, a 16-year-old girl arrived at school very early to take part in activities with the cheerleading squad. To her family, it was simply part of her everyday life. To her friends, it was the familiar image of a student who always arrived on time whenever there was a training session or a school event. There were no unusual signs to suggest that morning would mark the beginning of an investigation that would span multiple generations of detectives. As news began to spread throughout the local community, the first reaction was not fear but confusion. Residents tried to piece together what had happened from scattered fragments of information. Stories were passed from person to person, theories emerged, and were quickly replaced by others. Everyone seemed to have their own speculation, but no one truly knew what had taken place during that brief period on that winter morning. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a case far more complex than it appeared on the surface. The first pieces of evidence created hope that answers would soon emerge. However, the deeper they went into the case file, the more unclear the picture became. Some questions remained for years without ever receiving a satisfactory explanation. Some lines of inquiry were once expected to lead to the final answer, only to end in a dead end. Time continued to pass. Students graduated and left Federal Way. New generations entered the school without knowing that a mystery from the early 1990s was still sitting in law enforcement files. Meanwhile, the young girl's family continued to live with a question that never disappeared. What really happened on that winter morning? The search for answers lasted nearly 3 decades, stretching beyond the limitations of the era in which the case began. And to understand why this file became one of Washington's most well-known cold cases, we need to return to the girl at the center of the entire story. If you enjoy real-life investigations told in a documentary style, please subscribe to the channel and join us for the stories ahead. For those who knew Sarah Yarborough, what they remembered most was not a particular achievement or a standout moment, but the positive energy she brought into everyday life. Sarah was the sort of person who always wanted to be involved in the activities around her. She enjoyed keeping busy, enjoyed spending time with friends, and always found joy in the ordinary experiences of being a teenager. Born in 1975 inches, Washington state, Sarah grew up in a loving family that cared deeply for their children. Her relatives described her as an open, friendly young woman who found it easy to get along with others. Although she was still very young, Sarah had already begun to imagine her future, much like many secondary school students standing on the threshold of adulthood. She had her own plans, her own goals, and the dreams that any 16-year-old girl would carry through some of the most memorable years of her life. At Federal Way High School, Sarah was known as an active student. She took part in extracurricular activities and devoted much of her time to the school's cheerleading squad. It was more than just a hobby. It was where she built close friendships, learned how to work as part of a team, and created lasting memories during her school years. Training sessions, sporting events, and cheering from the sidelines became a familiar part of her daily life. Outside school, Sarah enjoyed many of the same interests as other teenagers her age. She loved art, enjoyed creative activities, and was always looking for opportunities to explore new things. Her friends remembered a young woman who smiled often, was always willing to have a conversation, and could easily make those around her feel more comfortable. It was one of the reasons so many people liked her from the moment they met her. The early 1990s were a period when Sarah was gradually building a life of her own. Many important milestones still lay ahead of her. The remaining years of secondary school, graduation, decisions about her future career, and an open future filled with possibilities. There was no reason for anyone in her family to believe that those plans would come to an end far too soon. When investigators look back on the case many years later, they often spoke of Sarah not only as the victim in a well-known criminal investigation, but as a young woman whose whole life still lay ahead of her. Before her name appeared in police reports and television news broadcasts, Sarah Yarborough was simply a teenage girl enjoying her school years, surrounded by family, friends, and plans for the future that she never had the chance to fulfill. The winter of 1991 brought the familiar cold mornings of the Pacific Northwest. In Federal Way, life continued as usual while most residents were still enjoying the weekend. While many families remained indoors to escape the December chill, Sarah Yarborough was preparing for the day ahead from an early hour. As a member of the Federal Way High School cheerleading squad, she was scheduled to take part in an activity at the school that morning, something Sarah always approached with her characteristic sense of responsibility and enthusiasm. The previous evening had been entirely uneventful. The 16-year-old spent her time following her normal routine, talking with family members, preparing for the days ahead, and getting some rest so she could wake up on time. For Sarah, it was simply an ordinary weekend, one of many she had experienced throughout her school years. There was no indication that the hours ahead would change the course of an entire family's life. Before daylight had fully broken on 14 December 1991, Sarah left home and drove her car towards Federal Way High School. The roads were relatively quiet at that hour. Streetlights still reflected off the cold, damp pavement after the long night. The city remained wrapped in the stillness typical of a weekend morning, a time when most people had yet to begin their day. For Sarah, it was simply a familiar journey she had made many times before. After arriving on campus, she parked her car and prepared to head towards the cheerleading squad's meeting point. Few people were around at that time. The school building stood silent in the faint light of the early morning. To anyone observing the scene, everything would have appeared completely normal. A student arriving at school to take part in an extracurricular activity, just as hundreds of students did every year. These were the final moments in which Sarah's life continued as it always had. No one knew that only minutes later, a tragic chain of events would begin to unfold. Her family believed she was simply at school. Her friends expected to see her at the scheduled activity. No one could have imagined that morning would become the starting point of one of the longest-running investigations in the history of King County. At that moment, Sarah Yarborough was simply a teenager looking towards the future, with plans and ambitions still ahead of her. Yet at the very place she had gone for an entirely ordinary reason on that winter morning, something unexpected occurred, setting in motion a mystery that investigators would spend nearly 3 decades trying to solve. On Saturday morning, 14 December 1991, Federal Way was still wrapped in the quiet atmosphere of a winter weekend. The first light of day slowly appeared over streets that remained largely empty, while most local residents had yet to begin their usual daily activities. For Sarah Yarborough, that morning seemed no different from many others before it. She left home early to go to Federal Way High School and take part in activities with the cheerleading squad. It was a familiar part of Sarah's routine, something her family and friends were well accustomed to. No particular conversation was later remembered. No unusual event drew anyone's attention. It was simply a 16-year-old girl carrying out her plans for the day ahead. As her vehicle entered the school grounds, the area was still relatively quiet. The buildings stood silent in the cold December weather. Few people had yet arrived on campus. The scene felt so ordinary that no one could have imagined it was about to become the center of an investigation that would last nearly 3 decades. Sarah entered the school grounds with her thoughts focused on the activities waiting for her. Her family believed she would return home after completing her schedule, just as she always had. Her friends expected to see her later that morning. Everyone assumed the weekend would unfold in its usual familiar way. But time began to move in a direction no one anticipated. As others gradually arrived at the school, a sense of confusion slowly began to emerge. Some plans did not unfold as expected. A few questions started to surface among those who were waiting. At first, they were perfectly ordinary questions. However, with each passing minute, a quiet sense of concern began to replace the assumption that everything would soon be explained. At that moment, no one knew that the Federal Way community was entering the opening hours of a case that would be discussed for many years to come. Nor did anyone know that investigators were about to face an extraordinarily challenging case file, one whose final answer would remain beyond the reach of the technology available at the time. The first signs that something was wrong were beginning to appear, and before long, a shocking discovery would change the course of that day forever. What was supposed to be an ordinary weekend morning at Federal Way High School unfolded much like countless others during the school year. Yet only a short time after activities had begun, that sense of normality was replaced by confusion spreading across the school grounds. The first people to arrive near the school grounds quickly realized that something was wrong. At first, it was simply a feeling that was difficult to explain. A few people stopped to look more closely. Confused glances were exchanged. Then that confusion quickly turned into concern, as they realized they were facing a situation far more serious than they had initially imagined. Information was reported almost immediately. Emergency calls were made while those present tried to understand what was happening. Within a short period of time, the area began to change completely. Routine activities were interrupted. The energy normally associated with student events disappeared, replaced by a heavy atmosphere that spread across the entire campus. Law enforcement officers arrived at the scene soon after receiving notification. Relevant areas were secured to protect any evidence that remained. Patrol vehicles appeared throughout the school grounds and surrounding areas, drawing the attention of an increasing number of local residents. News began spreading from students to parents, and from parents to the wider community. Within a matter of hours, nearly all of Federal Way knew that a serious incident had taken place. For Sarah Yarborough's family, it was the moment their familiar lives began to change in a way no one could have prepared for. Questions emerged one after another, yet almost none had clear answers. All anyone knew was that the 16-year-old girl would not be returning home as planned. Meanwhile, forensic specialists and investigators began their work within the tightly secured area. Every small detail was carefully documented. Every piece of evidence was processed according to standard procedures in the hope that it would help reconstruct what had occurred in the hours beforehand. At the time, no one knew that some of the samples collected that day would be preserved for decades and eventually become one of the most important elements of the entire case file. As the sun continued to rise over Federal Way, a major investigation officially began. Authorities understood that they were dealing with an especially serious case. What they could not yet know, however, was that the search for answers would last far longer than anyone could have imagined. The first days after the incident were marked by an unprecedented level of activity from law enforcement agencies in King County. Investigators conducted numerous interviews, reviewed Sarah's schedule, examined individuals who had been seen around the school grounds, and attempted to piece together every small detail into a complete timeline. In the early stages, many believed the answer was only a few steps away. Evidence was collected relatively quickly. Numerous leads were received. The atmosphere surrounding the investigation carried a sense of expectation that the person responsible would soon be identified. However, reality unfolded in a completely different direction. Every lead that was examined seemed to generate even more questions. Some investigative avenues that initially appeared promising ultimately failed to produce the results investigators had hoped for. Interviews continued for weeks. Reports were constantly updated. The case file grew thicker and thicker, yet the name investigators needed still did not emerge. Time continued to pass. The first weeks became months. Those months gradually turned into years. While life for most residents of Federal Way slowly returned to its familiar routine, Sarah Yarborough's family continued to live with the void left behind by her loss. For them, the clock seemed to have stopped in the winter of 1991, while the world beyond continued to move forward. Although the case was no longer appearing on the front pages of newspapers every day, it was never truly forgotten. As the years passed, new investigators continued taking over the work from those who had come before them. Old files were reviewed again. Theories that had once been considered were re-examined through a new lens. Each generation of investigators hoped it might find something the previous generation had missed. One of the most important decisions made very early in the investigation was the careful preservation of all evidence collected from the scene. In the early 1990s, no one could accurately predict how far forensic technology would advance in the future. Nevertheless, those involved in the case chose to preserve the evidence to the highest standards possible. At the time, it was simply regarded as part of the investigative process. Many years later, that seemingly ordinary decision would reveal its enormous value. Despite ongoing efforts, the Sarah Yarborough case gradually became one of Washington State's unsolved case files. Each year, around the anniversary of the incident, local media would once again mention her name. Her family continued to wait. The community continued to hope. And investigators understood that somewhere within thousands of pages of documents and the evidence that had been carefully preserved for many years, the answer still existed. It was simply beyond the reach of the technology available at the time. By the late 2010s, the Sarah Yarborough case file had existed for nearly 3 decades within the archives of the King County investigative authorities. During that time, a great deal had changed. Technology had advanced at a pace that those involved in the investigation in 1991 could hardly have imagined. Computers became more powerful. Forensic analysis methods became increasingly accurate. Across the United States, many cases that once seemed destined to remain unsolved were finally resolved through new scientific advances. In Washington, the investigators responsible for Sarah's case had still not given up hope. Although traditional investigative avenues had been reviewed repeatedly over the years, some specialists began to believe that the answer might lie in an area completely different from those previously explored. Rather than continuing to search for new witnesses or waiting for an unexpected confession, they turned their attention to genetic analysis techniques that were producing breakthroughs across the country. At that time, a relatively new concept was attracting significant attention within the criminal investigation community. This technology allowed specialists to use genetic data to establish family connections between distant relatives, gradually narrowing the search for an unidentified individual. The method differed significantly from traditional comparisons, which relied only on profiles already contained within law enforcement databases. For the Sarah Yarborough case, the most important factor was that the evidence collected in 1991 had been carefully preserved. Samples that had remained silent for decades now had the opportunity to be analyzed using tools far more advanced than those available when they were originally collected. Specialists began conducting new assessments in the hope that modern technology could detect details that earlier generations had not been equipped to uncover. The process required extraordinary patience. Analysts had to work through large volumes of data, develop multiple lines of research simultaneously, and carefully examine every result. The work continued quietly for many months and attracted little public attention. For Sarah's family, life continued alongside a question that had existed for nearly 30 years. For investigators, this represented a rare opportunity to move the case one significant step forward. Then the first signs of progress began to emerge. The new analytical results did not provide a complete answer immediately, but they opened a more specific path than anything that had appeared before. For the first time in many years, the investigation was no longer centered solely on broad theories. Instead, authorities began to see a route that might lead to the identity of the person they had been searching for nearly 3 decades. It was the most significant turning point since the case file had been opened in the winter of 1991. And as the pieces continued to come together, the search was finally moving closer to the answer that Sarah's family had been waiting for over what had seemed like an endless period of time. As the new investigative lead began producing promising results, detectives in King County understood that they were entering the most critical phase of the entire case. After nearly 3 decades of searching, the objective was no longer to determine whether a breakthrough was possible, but to verify every new piece of information with the highest level of caution. Any mistake had the potential to undermine years of work. The data generated through modern forensic analysis gradually led specialists to a group of individuals who shared familial connections with the source of the biological evidence preserved since 1991. From there, analysts constructed complex family trees, cross-referencing public records, residential histories, ages, genders, and numerous other factors in order to narrow the field of potential candidates. The process resembled assembling thousands of small pieces of a picture that had remained scattered for decades. After multiple rounds of review, one name began attracting particular attention from investigators. The man lived in Washington state and matched several of the characteristics the investigation had been focusing on. However, suspicion alone was not enough. After almost 30 years, prosecutors understood that any further action would need to be supported by solid evidence rather than assumptions. For weeks, investigators quietly monitored and verified information. Historical records were compared against newly obtained data. Forensic specialists continued conducting additional analyses designed to eliminate any possibility of error. Every positive result was subjected to multiple layers of verification before being accepted. Gradually, the gap between the 1991 case file and the man under scrutiny became increasingly narrow. What had once been considered a potential lead was beginning to evolve into a well-supported investigative theory. For many members of the investigative team, it was one of the most significant moments of their careers. Few detectives ever have the opportunity to witness a case that has remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, suddenly gain momentum after years of apparent stagnation. At the same time, prosecutors began preparing for the possibility that the case would soon enter an entirely new phase. They reviewed what would be required to present the matter before a court, should the suspect's identity be confirmed. Legal experts carefully examined every aspect of the file, fully aware that the case would attract substantial public attention. By 2019, following a series of independent verification steps, investigators believed they had finally identified the individual they had been pursuing for nearly 30 years. For the first time since the winter of 1991, the investigation was no longer centered on an unknown identity. The name behind the mystery had finally appeared in the files of law enforcement. And not long afterwards, the Washington community was about to witness a development that many had once believed would never happen: an arrest connected to the Sarah Yarborough case. In October 2019, after months of verification and cross-checking the results of newly completed analyses, King County investigators believed they had finally reached the point that generations of detectives before them had long hoped to achieve. The Sarah Yarborough case, once regarded as one of Washington state's most prominent unsolved investigations, now had a specific identity linked to the evidence collected during the winter of 1991. The individual identified by authorities was Patrick Leon Nicholas, born in 1963. At the time of Sarah's death, Nicholas was approximately 28 years old and living in Washington state. For many years, he had not been among the individuals publicly associated with the case. That fact made the breakthrough in 2019 particularly surprising, both to the local community and to those who had followed the investigation over the years. After completing the necessary verification procedures, law enforcement officers arrested Nicholas. For Sarah's family, it was a moment they had waited nearly 3 decades to see. Many had wondered whether that day would ever arrive. Over the years, hope had repeatedly been followed by disappointment. This time, however, investigators believed they possessed a body of evidence strong enough to move the case into its next phase. News of the arrest quickly attracted widespread attention. Media outlets across the United States revisited the story that had unfolded in Federal Way in 1991. Many local residents who had lived in the area during the early years of the investigation also followed the new developments closely. For them, this was not merely another criminal justice story. It was the beginning of the conclusion to a case that had existed for much of their lives. Meanwhile, prosecutors began preparing for legal proceedings. Thousands of pages of documents accumulated over nearly 30 years were reviewed once again. Forensic reports, evidence collection records, chain of custody documentation, and the results of modern scientific analysis all became part of the prosecution's case. Every detail needed to demonstrate the continuity and reliability of the evidence, from 1991 through to the present day. For the investigative team, identifying a suspect was not the end of the journey. They understood that every conclusion would ultimately need to withstand scrutiny in court. Only once the evidence had been presented and evaluated through the legal process would Sarah's family have the opportunity to receive the official answers they had been waiting for over so many years. After spending nearly 3 decades among Washington state's unsolved cases, the Sarah Yarborough file was finally preparing to enter its most important stage. The trial of the man, prosecutors alleged, was responsible for the tragedy that occurred during the winter of 1991. By the time the Sarah Yarborough case finally went to trial, nearly 30 years had passed since that winter morning in 1991. It was such a long period that many witnesses had grown older. Numerous investigators involved in the early stages of the case had retired, and an entire generation of Federal Way residents knew of the case only through news reports and documentary programs. Yet for Sarah's family, the memory of the 16-year-old girl had never faded. During the proceedings, prosecutors focused on presenting a comprehensive picture of the case based on both the historical investigation and the results of modern forensic analysis. They explained to the court how the evidence had been continuously preserved over several decades, how forensic specialists had re-examined old samples using advanced technology, and how the investigation had gradually led to Patrick Leon Nicholas. A significant portion of the trial centered on demonstrating the reliability of the chain of evidence maintained from 1991 through to the filing of criminal charges. Meanwhile, the defense sought to challenge certain conclusions reached during the investigation and questioned the accuracy of some of the methods used. Prosecutors, however, continued to present expert analysis, specialist testimony, and supporting documentation to strengthen their case. As the trial progressed, jurors were presented with a substantial volume of information relating to a case file that had existed for almost 3 decades. The trial attracted considerable attention from both the media and the public. Many people followed the proceedings closely because they understood that this was not simply an ordinary criminal case. It was also an important test of the modern investigative techniques that were increasingly being used to resolve long-standing cold cases across the United States. After reviewing all of the evidence and testimony presented in court, the jury reached its final verdict. In 2023, Patrick Leon Nicholas was found guilty. For Sarah Yarborough's family, it was the moment they had been waiting nearly 30 years to see. The journey that had begun in the winter of 1991 had finally led to an official judgment within the justice system. However, the verdict carried significance beyond Sarah's family alone. It marked the conclusion of one of the longest-running criminal investigations in Washington state's history and opened the final chapter of a story that had weighed heavily on the Federal Way community for many years. The sentence handed down in 2023 brought a legal journey spanning nearly 3 decades to a close. However, for Sarah Yarborough's family, it was not a moment that erased the loss they had carried since the winter of 1991. No verdict could bring the 16-year-old girl back. No passage of time could fully fill the void left by Sarah's absence in the lives of those who loved her. The only thing the justice system could provide was an official answer after many years of waiting. For the Federal Way community, the Sarah Yarborough case became a reminder of the power of perseverance in criminal investigations. Generations of detectives worked on the case over the years. Some devoted a significant part of their careers to pursuing answers without living to see the day the case was finally resolved. Those efforts, stretched across decades, ultimately helped bring the truth to light. Sarah's case also demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving evidence and the continuing advancement of forensic science. Samples collected in the early 1990s became the key that allowed the investigation to move forward once technology had advanced enough to uncover information that had previously remained beyond reach. In doing so, the case offered hope to many other families still waiting for answers in long unsolved investigations across the United States. Today, Sarah Yarborough's name is remembered not only as that of a victim in a well-known criminal case, but also as a symbol of a nearly 30-year search for justice. Her story reminds us that time can change many things, but it does not make the truth disappear. Sometimes answers take years to emerge, yet every advance in science and every determined effort by those pursuing justice can bring a case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved back into the light. Thank you for watching today's story. If you are interested in real-life investigations, cold cases solved after many years, and stories about the pursuit of justice, please subscribe to the channel and join us for future episodes.